Sigrid is going to begin by reading a little bit from her work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. My warmest thanks to the Chicago Humanities Festival and the University of Illinois for inviting me and hosting me here, and many thanks to all of you for being here. I'm not going to read very long, just a few pages, and I don't think, you don't need to know anything, except maybe that the dog's name is Apollo. Oh, I recently received an email from a reader who teaches middle school, and she told me that she had given as a writing prompt to her middle school children the question, if you could ask a dog any question, what would you ask? And one of the children wrote, when I grow up, what am I going to be? Something bad happens to the dog, a lesson learned early from childhood books. The animals in those stories often die, often in bad ways. Old Yeller, the red pony, and even when they don't die, even when they're not just alive but happy at the end, they suffer, often badly. Often they are put through hell. Black Beauty, Flicka, White Fang, Buck. The autobiography of Beautiful Joe, based on the life of a real dog and abounding in scenes of cruelty, begins with his brute owner slicing off Joe's ears and tail with an axe. No doubt, like many other readers, I remember crying over these books, never so hard as over poor Joe, yet never regretting having read them. Is there anything more compelling than a story about a child and an animal who bond? When I first knew I wanted to write, I was sure this was what I would write about, but I never did. When people are very young, they see animals as equals, even as kin, that humans are different, unique, and superior to all other species. This they have to be taught. Children fantasize about a world populated solely by non-humans. I liked to pretend that I was some kind of animal, a cat or a rabbit or a horse. I would try to communicate through animal sounds rather than speech and refused to eat with my hands. At times I kept this up for so long and with such conviction that it became cause for parental concern. A game, but at the core of it something dead serious, a trace of which has been carried into adulthood, the wish not to be part of the human race. Something bad happens to the dog in Milan Kundera's novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. The dog is given as a pup by the main protagonist, Tomas, to his wife, Teresa, for the very same reason, we are told, that he married Teresa, to make up for the pain and humiliation his incorrigible womanizing causes her. Though female, the pup is whimsically named after a male character in another novel, Anna Karenina's husband. Karenin the dog hates change, loves being in the country where he makes friends with a pig, and after developing terminal cancer is put to sleep. Karenin and Teresa are devoted to each other. Reflecting on their pure and selfless bond, Teresa concludes that such love is, if not bigger, nevertheless better than the corrupt, fraught, eternally disappointing, and compromised thing she has always had with Tomas. Idyllic is how Kundera describes human relationships with animals. Idyllic because animals were not expelled with us from paradise. There they remain, untroubled by such complications as the separation of body and soul. And it's through our love and friendship with them that we are able to reconnect to paradise, albeit by just a thread. Others go further. Dogs are not merely untouched by evil. They are celestial beings, angels incarnate, furry guardian spirits sent to watch over and help people live. Like the deification of cats, this belief is all over the internet and growing. It makes you wonder about people, I mean. Something very bad happens to a lot of dogs in J.M. Coetzee's novel Disgrace. The question persists, why won't David Lurie save the one, a mutt that has clearly come to love him and for which he, in turn, feels a special affection. Why can't that dog, a good dog, crippled but still young, and apparently sensitive to music, be spared the fate of all the other unwanted dogs destroyed at the animal welfare clinic? Why, instead of keeping this one dog, does Lurie insist on sacrificing it? Remember Agent Starling in The Silence of the Lambs telling Hannibal Lecter how, as a little girl living on her uncle's ranch, she had desperately wanted to save the lambs from the spring slaughter, how she picked up one lamb and tried to run away. I thought if I could save just one, but he was heavy, so heavy. In the end, like Lurie, she could not save an animal marked for death, not even one. We know they think, but do dogs have opinions? Kundera makes much of the fact that, unlike us, animals don't feel disgust. I'm not so sure about this, not even cats. But that dogs are not critical or judgmental is undeniably a big part of what endears them to us. This is what made educators think having kids with reading problems read aloud to dogs was a great idea. Also, perhaps, why performers like Laurie Anderson and Yo-Yo Ma have reported looking out at their concert audience and fantasizing that it's all dogs. Gratitude. I don't believe people are imagining it when they attribute this feeling to their rescue dog. I often feel that Apollo is grateful toward me. I want to know if he looks forward to things. She'll be home soon. Can't wait to eat. Tomorrow is another day. Even more, I want to know how he remembers the past. Does he have yearnings, regrets, sweet, sweet memories? Bittersweet ones. With senses as keen as theirs, why couldn't dogs have Proustian moments? Why couldn't they have eureka moments, epiphanies, and so on? Do you talk to Apollo, my therapist asks. Well, yes, to encourage bonding, it is recommended that people talk to their dogs, which seems to come naturally, though my guess is people are now doing it less and less thanks to our attention-devouring devices. I once heard a stranger in agitated conversation with her pug, and I suppose it's all my fault again, isn't it, she said, at which I swear the dog rolled its eyes. What do you talk to him about, the therapist wants to know. Mostly, I seem to ask questions. What's up, pup? Did you have a nice nap? Were you chasing something in your sleep? Do you want to go out? Are you hungry? Are you happy? Does your arthritis hurt? Why won't you play with other dogs? Are you an angel? Do you want me to read to you? Do you want me to sing? Who loves you? Do you love me? Will you love me forever? Do you want to dance? Am I the best person you've ever had? Can you tell I've been drinking? Do these jeans make me look fat? If we could talk to the animals, goes the song, meaning if they could talk to us. But of course, that would ruin everything. Thank you.
I'm so glad you mentioned Fleeka. Okay. First, I want to thank Mark for his very kind introduction and to the Humanities Festival, but most of all, Sigrid, to you for visiting our campus.
Thank you, Nena.
And for this beautiful, beautiful novel. For those of us who toil in the field of ideas, this novel is a treat, as it is an exploration of multiple philosophical issues that are so critical to understanding our humanity and our world today, as it also provides deep explorations of emotions of loss and our need to connect with both kindness and humor. I want to thank all of you for also braving our spring showers. I guess weather did not get the memo that it's spring here yet, but you're here, and what we'd like to do today in the brief time that we have is really have a conversation about the novel and leave time for questions and answers from you. We hope that for those who have read The Friend, this may provide additional insights to your experiences with the novel. And for those who have not read it, that you will be enticed to do so, if you haven't already. So welcome, Sigrid.
Thank you.
I'd like to just, for starters, what inspired you to write the novel, The Friend?
Well, what happened was that it was time to write something new, and it was also the time of the annual faculty reading at Boston University, and since there were several of us, they only wanted us to read for a little bit of time, like 10 minutes. So I sat down and I wrote some things that were on my mind. I just started writing, and that did turn out, in fact, to be pretty much the opening of this book. And around the same time, I knew that I was going to be reading at the University of Maryland, and they wanted 25 minutes. And I liked the response I got to the 10 minutes, and so I went on with that and thought, if I keep getting asked, I will have a novel. By that time, I actually knew that I was launched on something. But there were just certain things that were on my mind. For example, I had discovered that several people that I knew had gotten in the habit of thinking about suicide as something that would happen to them. They weren't crying out for immediate help. They weren't planning it. It wasn't that. It's just that it was clear that they thought that there was a good chance, that this would be how their lives were going to end at some point. So that was very much on my mind. And in fact, between the time the book was finished and it was published, one of those people did take his own life. And then I've always had a passion for animals, and I liked the idea of writing a book that had an animal, particularly a dog, as an important character. And then I've spent so much time writing, reading, that's so important in my life, and also teaching writing and literature over a period of years so that I could see all kinds of changes that have happened. And finally, I had tried to write something. I had an idea to write a story where the main character was a sex-trafficked young woman, and it just wasn't going to happen. I was having such difficulties with it, and I saw a way to talk about that in the book too. So as I kept writing, I found a way to braid all these separate threads together.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them, all right, that I think are so seamlessly woven together. The novel is presented from the point of view of the narrator, and we are in her head really throughout the novel as she has ongoing conversations with her mentor and professor who had just committed suicide in the novel, and with herself and her new friend, who's the dog. And we get glimpses of who she is in the world because we're so much in her head, but we want to know a little bit more about who she is. And there's an instance that when she describes why she was going to teach in a treatment center for victims of sex trafficking. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the narrator, how you conceived her? And
well, I saw her as I saw her as somebody who one thing that I didn't have on my mind when I started to write this was that I was going to write a novel about a writer. I mean, you're always told not to do that, and I certainly didn't want to do that. But the way I was describing her consciousness and the way she observed the world and the kind of thoughts that she had and the way she expressed herself, it would have been completely false to make her not a writer, because that's the way she thinks. So I saw her as a person, a woman at a certain point in her life where things have become very bewildering. That certain things that she took for granted when she was a student and when she was young about many things, but particularly about writing and literature. That all of that had changed a great deal, and in relation to and also her relationship with this mentor, who's also been her best friend for years. Of course, him taking his life She has to re-examine not only that relationship, but again, he was a writer, and so how did that play into him deciding to end his life that way? He also was deeply unprepared to grow older. That was a big part of things, and she too is growing older and having and not having the kinds of troubles that he did. But that again is something that she's examining. As far as the so it's an old friend of hers who's now a psychologist and working with these sex-trafficked women, who says, it really has helped them a lot to write, to keep journals about their experiences. So maybe you could come and you could they could do more writing, they could tell stories, they could have a kind of workshop. And so she does that because she thinks it would be a good thing to do. But at the same time, the mentor had given her this idea that, now you'll have an article or a book. That'll be so interesting. You'll be able to write about that. And this just calls everything into question for her because she can't do it. She tries and she can't do it. And part of it is that, if you're going to write something, your point is to make an aesthetic object out of it. And she gets all caught up in the idea of what would that accomplish really? Her writing about it, that if she ended up writing this, this polished prose piece about that, what did that do for her? What did that do for the women? And she just finds herself really, kind of like it's her totally unable to do this. At the same time, she doesn't want to. She feels that she can't use the material that she discovers from these women because that doesn't feel right either. She can't help but feel that she would be using them exactly. So those were some of the ideas that I wanted to talk about.
I mean, she's a very rich character, right? And there is this looming sense that she's lost something because she's lost her mentor and professor. But I also wanted to know a little bit more about the professor and about that relationship between them.
Well, the professor, they when they first met, they were both very young, and although he was only a little bit older than she was, he was already teaching, and that's how he ended up being her teacher and the teacher of a group of people. I'm thinking specifically of this group of women who become almost kind of groupies. He has enormous charisma. And also had an enormous amount to teach. In fact, there's a certain point where the narrator says that what she understood about the relationship to begin with was that he had the power that he had was a certain kind of knowledge, and he also had the power to pass it on to her, and that's what she wanted. But he also, being a certain kind of person, he wanted to have romantic relationships with whatever young woman was in his circle, which he did. And they didn't even have, I mean, you couldn't even dignify it by calling it an affair. They just had a night and then were able to remain friends, whereas one of her good friends ends up marrying him, and then they have a deeply troubled marriage, partly because of the chronic adultery. And she later says, years and years later says, I wish that I could have just been his friend like you, because now you've managed to have him in your life all your life, but I couldn't do that because everything was destroyed because we actually had this marriage that ended up so terrible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated relationship between her and, after she learns of the suicide, it's wife number 3, right?
Yes.
Okay, who asked her to take his dog, Apollo, a Great Dane, big dogs, right?
180 pounds.
180 pounds, right. And her friends begin to worry that she's obsessing, even putting her rent-controlled apartment at risk because they're not supposed to have pets in the apartment. And her friends keep telling her she needs a better way to cope with the suicide. Can you walk us through maybe the various stages here of bonding between the narrator and Apollo?
Well, when she first, she's a cat person, for one thing, and she
Okay.
does live in this apartment which she could lose if because there are no dogs allowed. But I mean, she is completely shocked to learn from his current wife that he had dropped a big hint. If anything ever happens to me, I think the narrator, who's unnamed, that's the person to call. She lives alone. She doesn't have a family. She works mostly at home. She loves animals. And so wife 3 says, you should take this dog. I never wanted this dog in the first place. And so I feel like the narrator is in that position. What would you do? I mean, this dog is not young anymore. It's 180 pounds. Most people who want a dog already have a dog. But the idea is that she feels like she doesn't really have a choice. So she takes the dog, but the dog is also in mourning. The dog is, as I say, you can't explain death to a dog. I mean, the best friend doesn't come home, and there's no way really to explain that. So the dog is also grief-stricken. So there they are. They're both in a kind of state of shock. And the dog is not friendly to her at first. The dog is kind of stuck with her. She feels like she feels like she's his jailer, actually, in her tiny apartment. But time passes, and the dog comes to accept her, and she grows. She begins to feel that there is something about taking care of this dog and doing this for her friend. That is in itself healing for her. And at a certain point, she realizes that she doesn't really care what happens with the apartment. She's just decided that whatever happens, she's not giving up this dog. And in her head, it is a kind of transference. She feels like she just feels that if she takes care of the dog, that she could not save her friend, but she can save this dog. And she does.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I think the narrator is also ambivalent about writing about the suicide. And at some point she asks, has writing destroyed more of the past? And is her writing about the suicide a way of destroying it? Or is it a way to work through her guilt? Or maybe is it a way not to forget the past?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question because she's having she's thinking about, and this comes very late in the book, about, she's kind of talking to herself and the dog at the same time. She talks about the problem with writing about something, that if you write about something and you get it down into these words, then you run the risk of that description of the experience, let's say, or the person, replacing the memory of the experience or the person. The example she gives is of people who go on vacation and they take all these photographs and they look at those photographs at different points after the vacation, and what they're really remembering later, are the photographs rather than the experience of the trip. So that's a worry of hers. And then she just has this thought that stories and photographs have probably destroyed more memories than they have preserved them, even though you write about something precisely because you want to get a grasp of it and you want it to survive. So you tell the story and retell it. But so it's a very difficult question.
Yeah. I think that, the narrator talks a lot about writing, not only her personal experience, right, with writing, but I think at some point it's, and their conversations, obviously, with her professor. How writers feel about writing, the connection between grieving and writing, the killing of the subject, the illiterate public, not this public here, obviously, the debasing of writing itself, the commodification of writing, etc. There's so much throughout the book about writing. And it is a rich and sort of a historical exploration of writing itself. Was the narrator, I kept thinking, also mourning the death of the novel?
Well, the death of the people are always bringing up the death of the novel, and then I know this is going to sound terrible, but writers are a little bit like cockroaches. They always survive. They always, everything else. It could be a nuclear holocaust, and the two things that will survive are cockroaches and writers. So one of the ways that, so everybody said the novel is dead, and writer's response was to call anything a novel. In that case, we'll just call any long prose work a novel. But I do quote a lot of people in this book, and one of the people I quote is the German writer Christa Wolf, who had very strong feelings about this. So her whole life, she could never get over the shame of being a writer. And she had this idea that to write about somebody is a way of killing them. The way she put it, if you tell somebody's story, it's like turning them into a pillar of salt. And she had written in this autobiographical novel how she had a dream that she actually had killed her mother and father by writing about them. So I think it's a little bit connected to the idea that I was talking about before. I also like the writer Czesław Miłosz, famously said, when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. Mm-hmm. That's been quoted a lot. But along with, as I say, writers love quoting that, but not so much Toni Morrison's statement that you shouldn't be using other people's lives for material. That everybody's like they have a copyright on their life, and it shouldn't be available for somebody's fiction. So yeah. I mean, some of these things, the ideas are interesting, but if you took them all the way, then of course you wouldn't be able to write. Mm-hmm. Just like you wouldn't, just like this idea of the ethics of using somebody else's suffering or pain in order to write your interesting novel. On the other hand, it's the writer's vocation to bear witness. Right. It is the writer's vocation to bear witness to social injustice. But then you get into this tricky thing, which, for example, somebody like Svetlana Alexievich has solved in her mind by writing what she calls documentary fiction, where she tries to keep invention out of it and authorial intervention out of it, and just create somehow empower the actual victims of whatever the injustice or the suffering were, to tell their stories, where she just becomes a tool. Mm-hmm. So she also her work is also sometimes called novels in voices or evidence fiction. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Evidence novels, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You talked a little bit about power, and given that is the theme of the festival this year, in its multiple dimensions, configurations, etc. But in your novel, I think we come to have a very intimate insight into power, particularly in the realm of sexuality and gender relations. We come to know that the professor and the mentor was a womanizer, particularly with the students, but not only. But as he grows older, the narrator observes that his declining physicality, which she recalls him describing as castration, and she also discusses one of his other mirrors that you've already mentioned, David Lurie, in Disgrace. The narrator notes that now young women have power over him. And does the professor's need to have power over others come from a place of insecurity? And does his aging reconfigure these power relations in the novel?
Well, I think what happens is that, I guess his, because he had that charisma When he was young, he was charismatic. He was very, very good looking. He later on, these women are cringing how back in the day people referred to them as a kind of literary Manson family because there was that he had that kind of control over them. I mean, that's extreme, but it was supposed to be a kind of joke. And also at the beginning of his career, it looked like he was going to have a much more successful career than he actually did. So that when so that it was actually possible at that early stage to believe that, he could actually win the Nobel Prize someday. Of course, then he actually became, his career, he did have a very reasonable career, very good career, but, it's something that does start to fade after a certain number of books. What happens is that there's that, for one thing. He feels that he feels to some extent like a failed writer or a lesser writer than somebody who didn't completely fulfill his promise. But then there is this sexual success that he has, and it's at a certain point he realizes that he can still get these women, these young women, to sleep with him, but he understands, he doesn't lie to himself. He knows that it's not because they're attracted to him. It's not for the sex. For the sex, they go elsewhere, which he knows very well. But it's for the thrill of being able to bring somebody in a position of authority like that to their knees. So it's true that he had authority, he had power. He misused this power, though back in the day when he did this, there were no rules against professors having romantic liaisons with students, as he keeps reminding everybody. And the better days, in his view, the good was much better then, of course. But he, so he can still, but he realizes that he doesn't have that kind of power anymore, although he has some power. And he flips the thing and he says, really, young women are the most powerful people in the world. And which actually he's quoting somebody, though it was unclear who he's quoting from. But yeah, so exactly that idea, which actually, you know what kind of power he's talking about. Right. And that's something else that I talk about, this idea which, it's an ordinary thing, but still it seems extraordinary to me that you have these men, it's not always men, but it's largely men. You have these men who will risk, the stakes are so high, they will risk everything. Family, position, money, everything. They stand to lose everything, but will still make that choice to have that relationship, to have that forbidden relationship. So I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, I'm supposed to come up, I suppose, I'm thinking with a reason for an explanation for this. And the only thing I've ever been able to come up with is because that's how men are. That's the only thing. It's like you think of somebody like Bill Clinton or JFK, and it's just like, as I say, the stakes are so high, and yet. Right. So that's what he means by these women, these beautiful young women are the most powerful people in the world because they can bring anybody down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. There's a beautiful arc, I think, in your novel where the narrator has a deep appreciation of senses. At the beginning of the novel, the narrator is doing research for a new book on the phenomenon of how women lose their sight after witnessing horrific events. By the end of the novel, the narrator is totally in tune with Apollo's keen sense of smell. And I just there's one line, smell the blue, which is to note what a beautiful, moving description of what we can smell. We can smell color. They also share in hearing the birds sing. And what I'd like for you to talk about is the sharing of senses between the narrator and the dog. What does Apollo bring to her which enhances her ability to mourn and accept what cannot be changed?
I'm not sure that it has anything in particular to do with the senses. I think there's something about the silence of the dog, the muteness of the dog, and a certain dignity that he has. He does get through it. Oh, well, there's a period of time where he howls all the time, but I think that there's something about the dignified way that he lives, his quiet, simple life. Also, the fact that he has, this is something that strikes her. He is so powerful physically. When she's one of the vets, grumpy vet, as I call it, that she takes him to. He says, well, the trick with these big breeds is that you just have to be careful that they can't ever know that you can't really make them do anything they don't want to. And she sees him. She goes out there in the world with him. He never attacks another dog. He never uses his full strength. He never uses his power. He comes in peace. And there's even a time where he passes a cat on a house stoop, and the cat, rears up, it spits at him, and he turns his face, and he turns the other jowl, and she scratches him, and he will not attack her or other dogs that come yapping at him. And I think that really, that really has a huge effect on her for how to live, really. And then, she's very touched by the fact that he's also losing his powers. His arthritis is worsening. As I say, he's not young. These large breeds don't live that long. Yeah. And she's concerned that his senses are not what they used to be. His nose, which is such an amazing nose, the things that a dog's nose can do, that he can't still do those things, and he can't. He's also aging, just like the mentor, but he's not committing suicide.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's very beautiful. I mean, those scenes in the country are just very, very beautiful. This will be my last question, and then I'll turn it over to you. The narrator says, what we miss, what we lose, and what we mourn makes us who deep down we truly are, loss and grief. This view is such a stark contrast to measuring our worth through our gains. Can you talk more about this?
Well, I think what I meant to say there is that it's just a thought that I had, that memory, you are what you remember to some extent. I mean, that's, I think that we all go through life with our minds constantly blending memory and imagination to write this narrative called My Life. And a big part of, I think, what makes a person what they deeply are is what they remember, of course, and what they miss, what they think of about what they didn't have, what they lost, what they grieve, what they mourn for. It shapes who you are, essentially. It's certainly not just what you've gotten in life. And then I also think that part of what makes people what they are is what they missed being able to do because of certain things, because they didn't have the opportunities that would have then enabled them to really be who they were, or there was some kind of strong bias from their family or their community or whomever, so that, and then they reach a certain age and they're aware of what they didn't have and what they might have had and who they might have been. And I do think that is, that it is an essential part of somebody's personality, and also, something that gives rise to a certain kind of mournfulness about life, even in people who are optimistic and generally happy. But sometimes that that deep, unexplained sadness that you feel, that feels like grief. And you know, part of it is for your father who died 10 years ago, that grief never really left you. But I also think it's just the mourning for things, for other things that you've lost besides people. I think everybody has a certain amount of grief. Life creates a certain amount of bereavement with every day that you live, and you store it up, and it becomes part of you, and you have to. You can't let that take over, because that's when you despair, which is what you don't want to do. You want to find the strength to live with that without denying it.
Right. Thank you, Sigrid.
Thank you, Nena.
I'd like to turn it over
Yes,
to. I think there's a couple of microphones.
Yeah, we've got mics on either side. Go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Please make sure to speak right into the microphone so that everybody can hear. So let's start right over here. Allison's going to bring you a mic right behind you.
I read this book on two levels. One is a total fascination with your discussion of the dog, and the other is everything else you talked about. Because I too love dogs and find them very interesting companions. Do you have dogs? Have you ever had a dog?
I actually do not have it. I am a cat person. Right? Now my family had a Great Dane, not a Harlequin, an all-black Dane, very, very large, this large, Taurus, they called him. But I had already left home by then. And then, like the character in my book, I did for a time have a dog. My boyfriend and I had a dog that was half Great Dane, half German Shepherd, but was really mostly Dane and looked like a Dane. But I love dogs. I've always loved dogs. I would be very happy to have many dogs if I could.
We've got a question in the back.
Hey, the passage you read was mostly the narrator talking about other books, and just a sort of small part at the end telling their own story. Mm-hmm. And the book works powerfully, like there's a kind of magic to it. But I can think of sort of all sorts of dangers of writing that kind of book. And I wonder if you could talk about that, sort of, whether it's a booky female narrator, a booky female author,
well,
not telling enough plot.
Well, see, that's what I'm saying. Like, when I started it, I would never have thought, oh, I'm going to write about a writer and the books she reads or the whatever, or the movies she sees, because that's not a good idea. But the way, this is a book that as I say, I started it and I kept on writing it, and it really did, I didn't write an outline or have ideas about a plot or whatever. It really just grew out of everything that came in it, came from what came before. And the way it happened is that while I was having these thoughts, I would think, oh yes, didn't Rilke, didn't he love dogs? And yes, he did. And he wrote that book, Letters to Your Young Poet, and look how different it is from when I was a student, how people respond to now, right? And then I thought, oh, Rilke's daughter, she committed suicide. It was like, and in fact, I have to say, while I was writing this, it seemed like that every road I went down, either on the side of the road or at the end of that road, there seemed to be a suicide. So then I would think, oh, Flannery O'Connor, didn't she also have someone who wrote to her the way Rilke did, some young writer who said, will you give me advice? And she did, and that person was known as A. And so then I was writing about that, and I thought, oh, and didn't A commit suicide? Why, yes, she did. And this just kept happening. So, or then when I was writing about, doing the workshop with the sex-trafficked women, I thought of that movie, Lilia Forever, which is exactly about that. And so I started talking about that. And then it just so happened while I was writing the book, I saw another movie about dogs in Budapest who rise up against their oppressors, and I just kept putting it down and making these connections, and hoping that they would it would work like that. That's why I say she had to be a writer, a teacher of writing and literature, and then of course she would refer to that, books that she taught, books that were on her reading list. But yes, but there are always risks. I mean, it's people who have like mystery writers, for example. I mean, who just sort of dive in with an idea. You can think of how many pitfalls on the way to where you say, oh, whoa, that couldn't be, because wouldn't that have, there's always something. There's always some risk involved that it's not going to work.
Right up front.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm rereading The Friend, and it's so beautiful and so profound, and there's all sorts of profound questions I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to ask you a trivial one instead, which is, when Apollo chews the second volume of Knausgaard's My Struggle to pieces, is that your statement about Knausgaard?
No, it's very funny, right? Okay, the question it relates to that at a certain point in the book, early on, one of the things that Apollo does is when she's not home, he messes up the house, right? He tears things up. That's why she stops leaving him alone. And one of the books that he tears up is a volume of Karl Ove Knausgaard's first volume of his six volume autobiographical novel. I teach that book, and so I would have that. That's one of the books. That I would have, and I was really the image, because you would need these jokes. I wanted him to tear up a book. He tears up the students' homework so that I'm able to say, honestly, the dog ate your homework. And then, just imagining how he would go, and you would need such sizable jaws to tear that particular book up. So that's really what they think about. I'm actually a big fan of Knausgaard's work.
We've got a question right down here, Allison, if you could bring the mic down to them. It's coming.
Oh. We'll get you next.
One line that really made me laugh as I was reading it was you had written something about, from a writer's report, about how you'd rather, that the unnamed narrator was saying that rather than having, she would not, she would manage to just not have any sales instead of having one reader who misread the whole book.
Oh, right, but that was actually the, that is where she's remembering an interview that her mentor and professor had given where he is having a lot of difficulty with the fact that you can now read customer reviews and can no longer hide from yourself how sometimes somebody will love the book, but they've completely misread it. It's one thing if they hate the book and misread it, you could say, well, they didn't get it, but if it's they love it and then they did, but that's not at all. So he was just, he was having so many difficulties as an aging writer, as a writer who wasn't doing well, and so this was one of his ideas. This actually came from somebody, I won't say who it was, but there was somebody who was talking, a writer who was talking to an audience, and she said that she sometimes felt she wanted to say, I don't want you to read my book. I think you're too stupid to read my book.
Your book was about a lot more than the woman and the dog and the fact that they were two solitudes. It has a lot to say about grief. It has a lot to say about the writing process. It has a lot to say about a lot. And I'm wondering how you feel about people who read the book who simply say as a person and a dog.
I feel like, you write, like Flannery O'Connor said, you have all the power in the world, about what you're going to write and how your book is going to turn out, but you don't have any power over how it's going to be read. And if you're that concerned with how it's going to be read and that everybody read it in one particular way, then you're probably in the wrong business.
I think
So
one more
there's this-
question. There was a question here.
Right here.
Yeah. Yeah, you do.
It's on.
It's on.
Okay. So it's hard to articulate my question, but it's somewhat related to what the man back there asked. There's so many literary references, and it seems to indicate that they just, kind of dug them up from your memory, and so there was no research done in terms of.
No, those.
I kept wondering, whether you sat at the computer and put in dogs, authors, trying to find all these. Obviously,
No.
you're a professor and you're a writer, so you have.
No, no, I mean, if most of what you do with your life is read and write, I think I do have a good memory for something that really affects me as a beautifully articulated observation about life, human experience, or about writing. And so what I would do is as I wrote, they would come to mind. These memories, I would remember, they would come to mind. And then I would go and look it up to make sure that I remembered it well, and sometimes I didn't remember it accurately. And that then might lead me to something else. I really didn't do research for this book. I did a small amount of looking up things about Great Danes, but most of it, I did not, now this is what I mean. I named the dog Apollo. I don't remember why I named him Apollo. But then I discovered that the Great Dane is known as the Apollo of dogs. So that kind of coincidence happened a lot. So Apollo, who is known as the most Greek of all the gods, yep. I doubt it. I really doubt it. I think I would have remembered that because I had a great, because I used to have this. Okay, well, anyway, but and then I did a little bit of research. I wanted to see what certain people had said about suicide, and in fact, it was in the course of that I discovered that writing in the first person, which I was doing, is a known suicide risk.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question you pose, and she poses this at the beginning of the novel. The question any novel is really trying to answer is life worth living?
Yeah, that is a quote from a Paris Review interview with the wonderful writer Nicholson Baker, which is really just an extension of Camus, saying that the only serious philosophical problem is suicide, and the question is life worth living or not? And the novel has been called, but I don't remember by whom. See what I mean? These things do. Okay, I don't remember by whom, has been called Philosophy by Other Means.
I want to thank you.
Oh, thank
for
you.
gracing
Thank you
our
all.
stage
Thank
and
you so
our
much.
university. She will be downstairs signing books. For those of you who do not have the book, hopefully you have been inspired